what we're going to look at today. So essentially the question I posed for the exit ticket yesterday was for you to think about how are the colonies going to react to a circumstance where Britain imposes punitive or punishing laws in the colonies, primarily focusing on Boston, Massachusetts, and the colony of Massachusetts following the Boston Tea Party, where all the tea was thrown overboard and destroyed, really to protect the elements of this, ring of smugglers who are trying to protect their business. Okay. And so what I want to do is I want to look at a very short review of information that tells us a little bit about what happens with this First Continental Congress, okay, and why is this such a significant event? This is not going to be the meeting that discusses independence as the final option, okay, and we'll kind of look at that here. So, all right, so I'm going to read through this and kind of pause for some moments to make sure that we are clear, but you should see a PDF that says the meeting of the First Continental Congress. So they met in mid to late 1774. The discussion about the meeting had already been taking place following the Intolerable Acts, which were called the Coercive Acts in Britain. The Intolerable Acts was a reference to what the colonists called it, okay? And it's important to know, again, the date here where we are. The date 1774, it seems like it's a lifetime since the French and Indian War had ended. Okay, so we've significantly moved forward from people, upset about not being moved west and no taxation without representation to now where, I would say 60% of the colonists are supportive of the Patriot cause, which would be, wanting Britain to acknowledge the colony's rights again. This is happening over and over again. But also there have been whispers about independence and autonomy and a sovereign government that could do just as good a job, if not better, than being under the rule of a king. Okay. So after the Boston Tea Party, I'm going to read this, follow along with me, please, if you would. The British adopted a divide and conquer strategy that sought to isolate troublemaking Boston from the other colonies, which leaders in Parliament believed were merely tagging along with Boston's radicals. Okay. Boston is such a city of revolution and rebellion right now, and Britain acknowledges that. So they essentially want the punishment and the isolation of Boston to be separate as to where the rest of the colonies will agree with Boston and say what they're doing, Britain, what Britain's doing toward Boston and Massachusetts is accepted. Okay, so the goal is that, the rest of the colonies will agree that the response from Britain is appropriate given the circumstances. In the spring of 1774, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, which were aimed solely at Boston and envisioned as punishment for its radical opposition to British policies. So in other words, the Tea Act, opposing that and destroying the tea. The Coercive Acts, which quickly became known as in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, consisted of 4 separate legislative measures. Among those, again, is the harbors closed until the Boston Harbors is closed until the tea's paid back. You have pretty much the entire elected government of Massachusetts being dissolved. You have a British General, Thomas Gage, taking control of the colony. You have the Quartering Act, kind of upping the ante of that to where the responsibility of the colonists toward the soldiers is increasing and the responsibility is increasing. And you also have the one that I think really stands out is British soldiers accused of crimes are going to Britain to have their trials because, and honestly, it's probably accurate that a British soldier cannot get a fair trial that is unbiased in the colonies at this point, okay? Instead of isolating Boston from the other North American colonies, the Intolerable Acts had the opposite result. Delegates from all the colonies except Georgia gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress in the autumn of 1774. The purpose of the Congress was to show support for Boston and to work out a unified approach to the British, okay, to how to handle what's going on. The reason why Georgia's not there, it's not because that they are opposed to the meeting. It's really due to the fact that they are dealing with invasions from Native American tribes from the South. A lot of them are Seminole Indians that are invading villages and communities in Georgia. And Georgia is depending heavily on British supplies and military support. And Georgia felt that if they go to this meeting and Britain finds out, then Britain will abandon their support for Georgia during this conflict with natives. But if you have 12 out of the 13 colonies present here, that's overwhelmingly a huge amount of evidence to suggest that there's a real concern here. This is not, the six or, this is not 7 colonies that are meeting or 9 colonies that are meeting about the Stamp Act. This is 12 out of 13. So there is a unity forming among the colonies that it's as if one is affected or one is targeted or one is attacked, everybody's attacked, okay? Nevertheless, divisions plagued the colonies. Though the Congress agreed to implement a boycott of British goods, the northern and southern colonies argued fiercely over a measure to ban all exports to Britain. The southern colonies were economically dependent on revenues from their exports of raw materials such as cotton and rice to the motherland. The delegates ultimately reached a compromise, agreeing to all exports to Britain, Ireland, and the British West Indies would be banned after a year, starting in September 1775. This would give the southern colonies some time to prepare for the economic impact of the export ban. And so essentially, it was an ultimatum. So the colonies said this was all going to be written down in a document that ultimately became the Colonial Rights and Grievances, or Resolves, as it's sometimes known. What would happen is, by the end of 1774, if the Intolerable Acts had not been repealed, the boycott would be all across the colonies. That was an agreement, with the exception of Georgia, again, because they can't speak for themselves there. If the Intolerable Acts had not ended a year later, by the time 1775 had, September of 1775, then exports of raw materials would cease to all British, colonies in Britain and Ireland and Europe. And so the reason why that's significant is that by the time we get to September of 1775, the Intolerable Acts would not have been repealed. The war has started with the battles of Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill in Boston. And the whole entire, focus is not so much about, trying to preserve some kind of, good relationship with the mother country, to how are we going to effectively defend our colonies now that there's been bloodshed on the battlefield. Okay. Now, it's interesting to point out that you notice that cotton and rice are the 2 staple exports. And really, it comes down to cotton more than anything. Tobacco is kind of hit, a sustained circumstance where there's not as much of a demand for it anymore. And so cotton has really become the overwhelmingly in-demand, crop, because it's changing the way people are being clothed. Cotton is being used to make clothing that is far more comfortable than wool, which was the traditional, material used for clothing at that time. So, the big thing that we're noticing here is that the colonies are really upping the ante toward what their expectations are. And they're doing this in the point of grievances and petitions to the king and to Parliament. On October 14, 1774, the First Continental Congress issued the Declaration of Colonial Rights and Grievances. The declaration denied Parliament's right to tax the colonies and criticized the British for stationing troops in Boston. And it really came down to, they made it very clear that they felt it was illegal for Britain to station troops in the colonies during a time of peace, because the French invasion that Britain was worried about never came. The insurgents of Native American groups invading the colonial area never came. And we basically found ourselves in a situation where the soldiers are in the colonies for one purpose, and that's to maintain order and to enforce laws. And so to the colonies, to many colonists, they feel that these outsiders have invaded their communities And because British soldiers don't see colonists as their equal, there's obviously going to be some rivalry between the two groups, okay? It characterized the Intolerable Acts as an assault on colonial liberties, rejected British attempts to restrict representative government, which was what happened in Boston or in Massachusetts, and requested that the colonies prepare their militias. Now, this is important because right now, the only defense that the colonies have are militias in communities. We're basically ordinary people that were called upon to defend their community if they were invaded. Okay. And if you're asking your colonial militias to prepare for, prepare arms and ammunition, then you're expecting that there could be a conflict soon. And that this is something that had not yet been suggested up to this point. Despite its harsh tone, the declaration did affirm, or affirm means basically to confirm or, reinforce the fact, reinforce Parliament's right to regulate trade, and did not challenge colonial loyalty to the British monarch, King George III. To me, this is the most striking statement that you're going to see from this document, which I posted in today's link. The fact that Britain acknowledges that they are still loyal British subjects after all this is pretty amazing. And I'm not saying that there weren't people that were not supportive of this, but that position or that opinion was largely overruled by the opinion that, yeah, our loyalty is to the king. Now, whether that's fully sincere or they're doing that because they know if they don't do it, then things could get a lot worse a lot sooner. Well, we don't know for sure, but as of now, the position is they're loyal to the monarch, okay? Although some of the more radical delegates, particularly Samuel Adams, who's from Massachusetts, already believed that war was inevitable, the Congress did not seek or declare independence from Britain at this time. The delegates agreed to meet again the following May if Anglo-American relations did not improve, okay? So that's relations between, Britain and the colonists, obviously, okay? Now, what happens in early 1775 is, because it's illegal to have an armed rebellion against the king, Britain is going to be dispatched. Britain is going to dispatch colonists outside of Boston to go to Lexington and Concord to confiscate weapons and to arrest the rebellious leaders, which were John Hancock and Samuel Adams. That's going to lead to the conflict, these small skirmishes at Lexington and Concord. But now that blood has been shed on the battlefield, everything changes forever. And this Congress is going to meet for a second time, the Second Continental Congress, very original, I know. And all 13 colonies are going to be represented. And out of the Second Continental Congress, which will meet and adjourn over a period of time, comes the Declaration of Independence, okay? So I'm going to take a look and just show you a few things that are highlighted in this Declaration of Rights and Resolve. You by no means, you don't have to read through this, but I do want to point out a couple things here. That, again, the purpose of this document is that this is a petition, and a petition to the king is something that you are expected to have a right to under English law. Okay, that is something that would, be commonplace during this time period, okay? And so we have a circumstance where they are acknowledging their loyalty to the king, but also expecting and acknowledging that there are problems that are had. And so in paragraph 3, they're basically referencing the Intolerable Acts, because we have a reference to Massachusetts Bay, we have a reference to Boston. And so they are describing them as impolitic, unjust, and cruel, as well as unconstitutional. But as you go through and you see these resolved, if something is resolved, that means it's been concluded. You see a lot of the same rights being brought up here in 1774 as we did in 1765 with the Stamp Act Congress. Okay? For example, part 2, that our ancestors who first settled these colonies were at the time of their immigration from the mother country entitled to all the rights, liberties, and immunities of free and natural born subjects within the realm of England. So that's reaffirming the fact that the people who are living in the colonies now, those ancestors who lived in the colonies before them, were granted these rights, and that should still be the same for now. Okay? But it's going to go through the fact that, you know, like number 9, keeping a standing army during a time of peace is against the law. Okay? They have the right to peacefully to assemble, consider the grievances and petition of the king, and all prosecutions, prohibitions, proclamations, and commitments for the same are illegal. And what's interesting is with number 8, peaceful assembly, right to grievance and petition, those are all aspects of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And it's no secret that a lot of the inspiration that you're going to see, obviously, in the original first 10 amendments, which are the Bill of Rights, are obviously from this time period living under British rule. Okay? Like, for example, if you look at the Third Amendment to the Constitution, it says you are not required to quarter troops in your home without, you know, your permission. Well, it's probably the most irrelevant of the amendments in the Constitution, but it clearly dates back to the American Revolutionary period when settlers and colonists were forced to house troops in their homes. Okay? And again, it goes back to reaffirming that they should not be losing their rights just because of the fact that they are thousands of miles away, because Britain cannot and shall not have that right to do so. And they want to make sure that that's clear, and they want to address this to the king. Now, you know, we have to think about now, again, because this is cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect. The Tea Act led to the Intolerable Acts, which leads to the meeting of the First Continental Congress. But so now we need to think about what's the next step here. So today's exit ticket, 3 questions, 2 of which, or 1 of which I think is very straightforward. Question 1, I feel is very straightforward. How would a boycott of British imports affect Britain's economy? I think we can all agree that we can look at that as a pretty logical answer. Question 3, how do you believe Britain will respond to another petition of grievances sent by the colonies? In other words, this document reaching Britain, how they're going to respond. But I want to really focus on question 2, okay? Despite the tone of the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, or Rights and Resolves, which reinforces all these rights that Englishmen are supposed to have that are being violated, even though the tone is negative and frustration, why do you believe the colonists still would commit to loyalty toward Britain and the king? Why are they not, you know, discussing independence? Why are they not threatening independence? Why is it that they are reaffirming or recommitting themselves to the crown? Why? And that's what I want you to be thinking about with this exit ticket. Because really, from this point forward, things are going to change forever. They really will. Because once conflict has happened, and once Britain basically gives the final ultimatum to the colonies of your loyalty shall be 100% toward the king, or you will be executed as a traitor, the colonies have no way of turning back. It's you know, there's no turning back now toward independence. Okay. And so take a look at the rights and resolves if you need to, but these three questions are going to be for the exit ticket for today. And then tomorrow, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about how the war starts, and then discuss probably the most significant influence on convincing ordinary colonists that independence from Britain was the only logical answer